to a lesson a few weeks ago by David Baker, Michael Baker's grandpa, and he had a lesson on Daniel. And I thought it was very interesting because he just went through the account of Daniel, pulled out very practical lessons, and that's what I would like to do tonight, except for our topic won't be Daniel, it'll be Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So if you would, let's begin in Daniel chapter 1. I should have been turning there when I told you I was turning there. Daniel 1, and the first mention of them is in verse 6. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 6. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That, of course, is all four of their Hebrew names. So these guys, just like Daniel, they were ripped away from their families. They were pulled from the land that they grew up in, brought to a new land as slaves, and dealt with all the same troubles that we associate with Daniel having to deal with, right? You know, I thought the names of these 5 men were interesting because verse 7 we see, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and of Mishael of Meshach, and of Azariah of Abednego. So names, especially back in the day, had purposes. They had meanings behind them. And the Hebrew names was Daniel, means God is my judge. Hananiah means God has favored. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah, Jehovah has helped. All 4 of their names are tied very closely to the God that they serve, to our God, Jehovah. And all their names revolve around God. But listen to some of the names that they have been altered to or the names they were given when they went into Babylon. Daniel got Belteshazzar, which is Lord of the straightened treasure. So they're trying to straightens treasure. So they're trying to straighten these young men in their eyes, right? They are straightened out. Of course, because they think that they aren't straightened out because they aren't doing what they think. But the names are so carnal. It's about treasure, right? It's about something physical. Shadrach is royal, or the great scribe, focused on royalty, earthly things. Meshach is guest of a king. This one's interesting because Mishael's who is what God is, right? And it's almost like they responded to that question with, the king that you're a guest of, right? You're a guest of the king. It's incredibly disrespectful. And Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. Same thing here. He was Azariah, Jehovah has helped, right? To servant of Nebo, right? So not servant of God, servant of this man. That's what they've changed his name to. Something that they get called constantly. By all means, these young men should have been disheartened, right? But they weren't. They were steadfast. In reality, these guys, let's read verse 4, all of these guys that were taken, children in whom there was no blemish, this is the whole group, not just Daniel, Azariah, Meshach, Hananiah, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning, and knowledge, and understanding, science, and such had ability in them to stand the king's palace, in whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So these are young men that have all been taken of the same group, and these are what they consider the best, right? The cream of the crop. So really, all of the young men here should have been doing what these 4 men were doing, but they weren't. These are the only 4 that stood up to these people. They were like, well, we've been taken away from our home, so I guess we were taken away from our God as well, right? That's what the other ones must have been thinking. This made me think of how many young people we have that do what's right when they're at home, but then later they go off and they go off the deep end, right? It reminds me of Proverbs 22. Let's go ahead and read that one. There's a couple verses in Proverbs I'd like to read. Proverbs, let's read 22 and verse 6. It says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he shall not depart from it. Proverbs 22 and verse 15 says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. And then Proverbs 13 says something similar. 13 verse 24 says, he that spareth the rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. Right? So all these verses are talking about teaching your kids while they're young, punishing them, whipping them, which is a biblical concept. Of course, there's a difference between beating and whipping. Right? Whipping is always a controlled action, and it's done purely out of love for the child. When I got a whooping, that's what it was. Whooping, that's what we say in Texas. Okay. My dad would always sit me down afterwards, and he would make sure that I understood why I got a whooping, and he would always tell me that he loved me. A lot of kids get beaten because of anger of the parents or things like this. That's not the same thing, right? Also, as a parent, when you're chasing your child, you need to let it go afterwards, right? Once you punish the child, don't even let it in your mind anymore. Okay, I forgive this child of this thing, right? Because that's how God treats us. As soon as we have been punished, like the children of Israel, once the punishment is over, God's quote-unquote memory of it is over, right? It's no longer written down in the book of life. Same thing that we need to do for our children. I say as a person who is a father, but yet to have one I can hold. Yeah. So these are biblical principles. It's not me saying this, it's the Bible. I always felt better after I got a whooping. I would get a whooping from my dad. We'd have a conversation. Tell me you love me. And afterwards, it was like, whew, like okay, it's over. I'm not in trouble anymore. I mean, though obviously, whooping's not the fun part, but it makes you better. It improves you, right? That's how God disciplines. I know some people who refuse to discipline their children in the church. They could have reasons like they were beaten or abused, and they have a hard time with it, right? Some people, that's true. It could be that they don't know any better, right? They don't know that, people will read books from Dr. Spalding or whatever, a bunch of earthly people, but God tells us, if you love the child, you don't spare the rod. You don't spare the whooping just because you love them. Because that's not true love. True love is to chasten, rebuke, and get them to act the way that they're supposed to. What I see most, and the thing that actually troubles me, is laziness. Right? People would rather give their kids whatever they want than deal with the situation. That's why we have a lot of iPad babies, That's what I like to call them. But, kids who don't have any discipline. And it's not the kid's fault because they need to be taught. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, and the rod of correction drives it far from them, right? That's our job as parents to do that. And of course, we make our own decisions. And it's possible for us to do right, train up our child the way they should go, and then they choose wrong. Proverbs 23, verse 7 comes to mind. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is it. Eat and drink saith he, but his heart is not with thee. So, we are what is in our hearts. And sometimes, people decide to be not what they need to be, even though they've been taught correctly. I know people who were raised up right next to me. I know they were taught exactly right, and then now they're not doing right. It's because that was their decision. They chose to do that. So, as a parent, you do the best that you can, and if you do, the odds of your children doing what they're supposed to are very high. But of course, occasionally, that can't go like that. Back in the account of Daniel, let's go back over there. I think I'm just going to mark this. It's going to help me out a lot. Actually, okay. I'll probably already turn back to my now, but hold your hand in Proverbs, and we'll start in 1 Corinthians. So in the account of Daniel, some chose good, some chose evil. It is much easier to choose good when there are good people around you. When you've surrounded yourself or when you have been surrounded by those who are doing right. So 1 Corinthians 15:33, a verse you probably all know very well. Be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners. Or evil lifestyles corrupt good morals is another way to look at this. Basically, being around people who are evil will cause you to want to do things that are evil. Being around people that are good will do the opposite. It's a pretty simple passage, but it is true in reverse as well. Proverbs 27, verse 17. Now. And also another verse we probably know very well. Proverbs 27 and verse 17. Iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. Edification is a big part of what the church does. And really, the purpose of edification is building each other up so that we can be stronger together. Right? That's kind of the idea here. You need to surround yourself by people who are not earthly, people who are Christianly, or whatever the phrase would be, that moral, righteous. There you go. Iron sharpeneth iron. And so that's kind of what's going on here in Daniel. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. I'll put it on marker here. Okay, Daniel 1 and verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So this is Daniel, and he's here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel said this, but by implication what we see later on. So did they. All four of them made this decision that they wouldn't do something that was wrong. And I'm sure that them doing it by themselves would have been much more difficult, much more intimidating. This makes me think of, we won't turn there, but Job 31 and verse 1 said that Job made a covenant with his eyes. He had already made a decision in his heart, in his mind, in his biblical heart mind, that he wouldn't lust upon a woman. He said, I've made a covenant with my eyes. I've made the decision. The decision had already been made. It's something that's been made a while back. Their minds were made up to do right in Daniel from the beginning. From before they were taken, they chose to follow God, to serve God. Let's read verse 11, starting in verse 11 in Daniel chapter 1. Then said Daniel to Melazar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenance be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat the portion of the king's meat, as thou seest. Deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. So this guy was not really into this at first. It said he consented unto this. He was like, okay, fine, we'll do it. That's fine. Right? He took a little bit of persuasion, a little bit of persistence. Sometimes to change your environment, you just need a little persistence. Right? A small example from my youth. When I worked at Chicken Express, I made it very clear from the beginning I would not be working on Sundays, and I would not be working on Wednesday evenings, because I had worship. I wasn't going to do that. And especially, like Chicken Express, it seems a little bit silly to even think about that, but some people don't make that connection there. One day, they put me on the schedule for a Sunday. I've been working there for about a year, and I saw my name on the schedule on Sunday. I told them, okay, well, I'm not going to be there. They told me, well, you have to be. It's on the schedule. I was like, well, you can either find someone else to fill that slot, or you can fire me and then find someone else to find that slot, but I'm not going to be coming in on Sunday because I have to worship. And then they could see the dilemma, and they were like, okay, fine, we'll find someone to fill your spot. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of persistence to change your environment. I know that's a very small example. A Chicken Express job isn't really the highest value job in the world, but you have to be. These people had decided in their hearts before they were even taken that they needed to do what was right, and even very high-stakes situations, like their life was on the line, they decided, we've already decided, we're going to do what's right. And then let's read in verse 15 of Daniel chapter 1 and see what happens as a result. At the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melazar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. So, they did what they were supposed to do. They didn't defile themselves with the portion of the king's meat. And as a result, they were looking better than the rest of the guys. And the guy who was in charge of them was like, okay, all right then, no one else gets the king's meat. Now we're all going to eat pulse. Right, that's what he tells for everybody. So they changed the environment not only for themselves, but for everybody. Everybody else probably didn't like that, but it got them to do what was right. And then verse 17, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, but Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, the king had said he should bring them in, and the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. In all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king required of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even into the first year of King Cyrus. So we see here that God blesses them due to their obedience. Now, the next time we hear from these guys, we hear from Daniel, of course, but Daniel chapter 3 is the account of the fiery furnace. Let's start in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was three score cubits, and the breadth thereof 3 cubits. And he set it up in the plain of Dura, in the prince of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes and the governors and captains and judges and treasurers and all these guys were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. So a law has been put into place. Nebuchadnezzar put up a big idol, essentially, and says, you must worship this thing. That is the law. This is what everyone has to do. They have to worship this thing. And at first, we don't even... Well, let's read verse 6, what happens if they don't do this. And whosoever falleth not down and worshipeth shall at the same hour be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the instruments, they fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So we still have yet to hear from our 3 characters. But in verse 8, we hear the fruits of their labor. We see what they've been up to through these people who are coming to hate on him, essentially. Verse 8. Wherefore, at the time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound, and it repeats what he had said in verse 11, and whosoever falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain of the Jews, whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. There are always going to be those who seek to do you evil because you are good. Let's turn to Hebrews 11 really quick. Hebrews 11 and verse 7. We see here this is talking about Noah. It says, by faith Noah, being warned of God of the things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. Noah condemned the world by doing what was right. If everyone is evil, then they can say, it was too difficult. No one could do it. No one did do it. But when even one person does that which is right, it shows that everyone could have done that which is right. He condemned the world by doing that which God asked him to do. Usually this makes people pretty angry at the righteous ones, and that's the same thing that's happening here in Daniel. These people are coming and saying, hey king, these guys, they're not bowing down to the thing that you put up and said everyone has to bow down to. And they've basically told it, essentially if Nebuchadnezzar doesn't respond to this, they're calling out him. He would have probably a pride issue over this. But he likes these guys. He's already, in chapter 1, we already found out that he's done very good to all these guys. And so he probably doesn't want to punch them. And we see here that he gives them a little bit of slack. So, verse 13 in Daniel chapter 3. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. And he asked, hey, is this true? Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up. Now, if ye be ready at that time, when you hear all these instructions, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made, well. But if you worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace, and who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? He says, okay, you give me one more chance, just do what I tell you to do, and we'll leave you alone. But if you don't do it, we're going to throw you in the fiery furnace, okay? Verse 16. Look at their answer here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. It says they're not careful to answer him. Some would see this as disrespectful, but the word has implication of being prepared. He says we are ready to answer. We don't need to hold anything back because we've already thought it out. The decision has already been made. This reminds me, my dad always makes this illustration. And it's from a John Wayne movie, which I've seen it before. Yeah, this one I've seen. So, these cowboys have an opportunity to do something that's immoral against what they had already decided they were going to do, right? One of them looks at John Wayne and is like, well, what are we going to do? Like, what's the decision? What do we get? Like, what are we supposed to do here? And John Wayne looks at me and says, that's already been decided. All right, we already decided way back here that we're going to do the right thing. So we don't even have to think in this time of impulse decision making. It's already made up. We don't have to think about it. That's what they're doing here. We've already prepared for this situation. We know that we can be cast in the fiery furnace. We're not careful. We're prepared to answer this question. Verse 17. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. They are incredibly bold in their answer. And they know God has the power, but they aren't arrogant to assume that God would save their physical lives. Everything they say and do in this passage is to glorify God. Same thing with us. Everything that we say and do should be to glorify God. Verse 19 through 21. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He had a kind demeanor, changed it to an angry one. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated, 7 times harder than usual. Verse 20. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Pause right here. There is an important thing to note, that is, sometimes good people get punished on this earth. 2 Timothy, hold your hand here, of course, and then go to 2 Timothy. Chapter 3, and verse 12. 2 Timothy 3:12. Yea, all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. All that live godly should expect persecution. If you're living godly, it's coming. Now, in the first century, it was being stoned, put to death, very intense. Today, it might be you lose your job, you lose your friends, people talk bad about you, things like this. But that still is persecution, and that is something that we should expect and be able to deal with when the time comes. Okay, back to Daniel 3 and verse 22. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The men that threw them into the fire died because of the heat of the fire. Sometimes you can follow an evil man and do evil as a result. So that's what these guys did. They're just following orders. And some people would use that as an excuse to not do what's right. We talked about earlier situational ethics. They did what Nebuchadnezzar commanded them to do, and they died because of it. Right? Verse 23. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astonished, essentially astonished, and rose up in a haste and spake and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast three men down into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. So, Nebuchadnezzar's shocked here. Hey, we threw three guys in there, bound up. There's four guys, and they're all loose, walking around. Where did that fourth guy come from? He said, is like the Son of God. So, some say that this is literally Jesus. Some say this is an angel. It could be that Nebuchadnezzar received a revelation to say that this is the Son of God. But the real lesson that we need to pull from this is that God cares for His children. And sometimes your tough situation can be used for the furtherance of the gospel. Right? Just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean that it's going to be, the result is going to be bad. Let's read verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth, come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. Let's go ahead and read through verse 27. And the princes, governors, captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose body the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of the fire had passed on them. It didn't even smell like fire. Then Nebuchadnezzar, verse 28, Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see here there's a change of heart. Who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree to every person, people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So, the tough situation these guys were in, they were bold. They stood up against tyranny, essentially, against God. God delivered them. We see that as a result, Nebuchadnezzar began changing. We know that later on he would go far away and then have a punishment and then come to himself and realize that God is not the only God. In here he says, verse 29, he says, there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. So he's saying, yeah, there's lots of gods, but none of them can do like this. Eventually he's going to say, there's one God. That God is Jehovah. This is one of the first steps in that process. He sees the results of these men doing that which is right and God delivering them, and God turning their bad situation into a good situation. We need to be like Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Let's turn to Romans 1. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed, from faith to faith, as is written, the just shall live by faith. If we're not ashamed of the word of God, we live openly as Christians. The people will see it, people will change, and in verse 17, therein is the righteousness of God revealed, will reveal God's righteousness and glorify Him in the process. There's a lot we can learn from these people, but these are just a couple of lessons that I thought were important for us to take into account, to learn to be bold, to teach others, stand for the truth even when it's hard, when it's difficult. But not all of us here are Christians. Well, I assume actually. I don't know. Maybe all of us are. But if there are any of us who are not Christians, make it right today. Change your life. Choose God so you can be bold. You cannot be ashamed of Christ. If you have any needs of the church as well, this time come as we stand and sing.